"He's not my uncle," the little girl whispered, eyes locked on the dog. "He took me from my real home and no one believes me." Everyone else looked away, but the police dog didn't. He barked once, then again louder and louder, refusing to stop. So what did he see that no one else did? The afternoon sun beat down on the boardwalk of Harbor Bay, a picturesque coastal town where tourists flocked to escape their everyday lives. Officer Mason Reed adjusted his sunglasses and inhaled deeply, savoring the salty air, a welcome change from the urban smells of the city precinct where he'd spent the last 7 years. Mason had never been one for vacations. The last time he'd taken more than a weekend off was nearly 3 years ago, and even that had been interrupted by an emergency call that pulled him back to duty. His captain had practically forced him to take these 2 weeks, citing department policy on accumulated leave and making thinly veiled comments about burnout. "You're no good to anyone if you're running on empty," Captain Donovan had said, sliding the leave approval form across his desk with finality. The truth was, Mason didn't know how to stop. Ever since the incident 5 years ago, the one that still visited him in dreams, he had thrown himself into his work with a single-minded dedication that both impressed and concerned his colleagues. When the opportunity came to transfer to the K-9 unit, he'd seized it immediately, finding in his K-9 partner the one relationship that didn't demand explanations for his silences or concerns about his intense focus. Beside him now, Shadow, his Belgian Malinois partner, walked with military precision, his alert amber eyes scanning the crowd with methodical efficiency. The dog's muscular frame moved with fluid grace beneath his sleek tan and black coat, drawing admiring glances from passing tourists and respectful distance from more observant locals who recognized a working K-9 when they saw one. Shadow had come to the department 3 years ago with an impressive military background, having served 2 tours overseas with a handler who had been killed in action. The transition to police work had been challenging. The dog's training had been primarily focused on explosives detection and apprehension in high-threat environments. For months after his arrival, Shadow had remained aloof, performing his duties with mechanical precision, but forming no bonds with the officers who worked with him. Until Mason, something in the quiet, intense officer had resonated with the grieving dog. Perhaps it was their shared experience of loss, or simply the fact that Mason never tried to force a connection, allowing Shadow the space to adjust at his own pace. Whatever the reason, they had gradually formed a partnership that had become legendary within the department. "Come on, buddy," Mason said, giving the leash a gentle tug. "We're off the clock, remember? Try to look like you're enjoying this." Shadow's ears remained upright, his posture unchanged as a group of laughing children ran past. Where Mason saw harmless vacationers, Shadow seemed to categorize each passerby as a potential threat requiring assessment. The contrast between them had always been stark. Mason, with his tall, lean frame and perpetually serious expression that rarely broke into a smile, and Shadow with his unflinching professionalism and laser-focused attention to detail. Somehow their similarities had forged one of the most effective canine partnerships in the department. While other handlers tried to mold their dogs to match their own temperaments, Mason had learned early on to embrace Shadow's intensity. The senior K-9 trainer had pulled him aside during their first month together. Most handlers try to change their dogs. The trainer had said, watching Mason and Shadow run the obstacle course, "But you're letting him be who he is. That's rare. He's better at his job than I am at mine." Mason had replied with a shrug. "Seems stupid to mess with that." 3 successful years and 14 departmental commendations later, they'd become something of a legend in Riverside County. The drug runners called Shadow El Fantasma, the ghost, for his uncanny ability to find hidden compartments and concealed packages. The local press dubbed them the Silent Sentinels, the taciturn cop and his intensely focused partner, who somehow combined to form a perfect team. As they approached the seafront hotel where they'd be staying for the next 2 weeks, Mason found himself noticing details he normally wouldn't. The way sunlight refracted through the fountain in the central plaza, the varied cadence of different languages spoken by tourists from around the world, the salt-tinged breeze that carried hints of grilled seafood from nearby restaurants. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to simply experience a place rather than analyze it for potential threats or evidence. "This is supposed to be a vacation," Mason reminded his four-legged partner as they walked through the hotel's revolving doors. 2 weeks of sun sand and absolutely zero criminals to chase. "Think you can handle that?" Shadow's only response was a subtle shift of his ears as a man with a large duffel bag walked past them into the hotel lobby. "Seriously?" Mason muttered. "That's just some guy with beach gear." In their room, Mason changed into more casual clothes while Shadow performed a methodical inspection of the space, moving from corner to corner with practiced efficiency before settling into a sitting position near the balcony doors, his attention fixed on the beach below. "You're killing me, you know that," Mason said, flopping onto the bed. 3 years together, and I still can't get you to understand the concept of relaxation." He studied his partner, remembering the day they'd first met at the K9 training facility. Shadow had been rejected by 2 previous handlers. Too intense, they'd said, too independent-minded. Where they had seen a problem dog, Mason had recognized something different, an extraordinary intelligence paired with uncompromising dedication. They connected immediately, as though recognizing kindred spirits separated only by species. The specialists had marveled at Shadow's abilities during training. Unlike most dogs who excelled in 1 or 2 areas of police work, Shadow demonstrated remarkable aptitude across the spectrum, tracking apprehension article searches and his truly exceptional talent, human behavior analysis. He could read subtle changes in body language that even trained officers missed, sensing deception, aggression, or fear with uncanny accuracy. "You know what your problem is?" Mason continued, scrolling through local restaurant reviews on his phone. "You've got no off switch. It's all work all the time with you." Shadow's ears twitched in response, his gaze still fixed on the beach below. Mason sighed, recognizing the futility of his complaint. In truth, he and Shadow were more alike than different, both driven by an internal compulsion to serve, to protect, to maintain vigilance, even when others saw no threat. It was what made them such an effective team, but it also made the concept of vacation nearly incomprehensible to both of them. Still, he had promised Captain Donovan he would make a genuine effort to disconnect, to find some semblance of work-life balance. The captain's concern had been evident in their final conversation before Mason's departure. "You've given everything to this job for 5 years, Reed," Donovan had said, his weathered face serious. "No one questions your dedication, but you need to remember there's a world outside these walls, outside this work." Mason had nodded, not trusting himself to respond. How could he explain that the work was what kept the darkness at bay, that the structure of duty and purpose was what allowed him to function, to move forward, despite the weight of memory and regret? "I've got dinner reservations tonight," Mason told Shadow, setting down his phone. "So for a few hours, you're going to pretend to be a normal, friendly dog and not a furry police officer. Think you can manage that?" "Atinam." Shadow's only acknowledgement was a slight tilt of the head, his eyes never leaving the window. The Lighthouse Grill occupied prime real estate along the boardwalk, its open-air design allowing the evening breeze to carry the mingled scent of grilled seafood and tropical cocktails. Mason selected a corner table with a good view of both the entrance and the beach beyond, already regretting his decision to bring Shadow along. "Remember our deal," Mason whispered, adjusting the casual collar he'd replaced Shadow's working harness with. "Just pretend you're a regular pet for one night." But regular pets didn't perform perimeter checks or track the movements of every person who entered the restaurant. Regular pets didn't maintain the alert vigilance of a soldier in hostile territory when surrounded by laughing tourists and clinking glasses. Mason was considering finding a pet-friendly cafe with more secluded seating when a woman approached his table. She was tall and athletic, with curly dark hair framing a face that was more striking than conventionally beautiful. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, indicating the empty chair across from him. Mason started to explain he was waiting for his takeout order when she added, "I'm Adrian Carter. We spoke earlier." The marine biologist. Recognition dawned. Mason had forgotten about the dinner meeting he'd reluctantly agreed to at Captain Donovan's insistence. The captain's wife's cousin was conducting research in Harbor Bay and had generously offered to show Mason around the area. It had felt like a setup, and Mason had only agreed to placate his superior officer. "Right, Dr. Carter. Sorry I didn't recognize you from the awkward video call your captain forced on us." She finished with a smile. "Don't worry about it, and it's just Adrian." "Mason," he replied, standing to pull out her chair. "And this is Shadow." "He's intense," Adrian observed, taking her seat while maintaining a respectful distance from Shadow. "Is he always so alert?" "Occupational hazard," Mason admitted. "We're both cops K9 unit. He takes his job a little too seriously sometimes." "A police dog?" "That's fascinating," Adrian replied, her expression warming. "I study animal cognition as part of my research into marine mammal behavior. The parallels between working dogs and certain cetaceans are remarkable. Complex reasoning task, adaptation, emotional intelligence." The conversation flowed more easily than Mason had anticipated. Adrian was knowledgeable and passionate about her work studying the local dolphin population, but she also had a gift for drawing out his own experiences without making him feel interrogated. She asked thoughtful questions about Shadow and their partnership, genuinely interested in the training and bond that made them effective. "So you've been partners for 3 years?" she asked, taking a sip of her wine. "That's a significant relationship." "The longest I've had since my divorce," Mason admitted, surprised by his own candor. "My ex-wife said I was married to the job." She wasn't wrong. "What about Shadow? Does he have a life outside work?" Mason considered the question. "Not really. He lives with me, but even at home, he's always on alert. The K9 trainer says he's the most work-oriented dog he's ever seen." "Two perfectionists?" Adrian observed with a smile. "No wonder you're so in sync." Mason was about to reply when he noticed Shadow's demeanor shift. Ears forward, body tensing slightly as their entree arrived. At first, Mason attributed the change to the arrival of food, but as the minutes passed, Shadow's restlessness increased. He shifted position repeatedly, ears constantly swiveling toward the entrance, soft whines occasionally escaping despite his training. "Is something wrong with him?" Adrian asked as Shadow rose slightly before settling again. "He's just adjusting to vacation mode," Mason explained, though he knew better. In 3 years of partnership, he'd learned to read Shadow's signals as clearly as any human language. The dog wasn't simply alert, he was detecting something specific, something that triggered his trained response patterns. The server had just refilled their water glasses when Shadow suddenly went rigid, his attention laser-focused on the entrance. Mason turned to see a man in his mid-30s walk in, firmly gripping the hand of a young girl who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. The man was average in every way. Medium height, unremarkable brown hair, wearing casual vacation clothes. Nothing that should have triggered Shadow's intense reaction. "Sir, your dog seems agitated," the server commented nervously as Shadow's low growl became audible. "Sorry about that," Mason apologized, shortening Shadow's leash. "He's usually better behaved." Across the restaurant, the man led the little girl to a table near the bar. The girl, thin with blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, sat without looking up, her shoulders hunched forward. Something about her posture struck Mason as unnatural. The rigid control, the careful smallness of her movements, as though she were trying to minimize her presence in the world. "You know them?" Adrian asked, following Mason's gaze. "No," he replied, though something about the interaction nagged at him. The girl hadn't spoken once, hadn't looked up at the server, hadn't displayed any of the typical fidgeting of a child in a restaurant. Shadow suddenly stood, a short, sharp bark escaping before Mason could stop him. "Shadow!" Mason hissed, grabbing the leash more firmly. "Down!" The man at the bar straightened his eyes, scanning for the source of the disruption, momentarily locking with Mason's before quickly looking away. In that brief connection, Mason caught something unsettling. Not fear or anger, but calculation, a rapid assessment of threat level that seemed practiced and deliberate. "I'm sorry," Adrian said, setting down her napkin, "but I think your partner is trying to tell you something. I've studied enough animal behavior to recognize this isn't just random agitation." Mason was surprised by her perception. Most people would have simply been annoyed by the interruption. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "Shadow doesn't react like this without cause." Shadow barked again, louder this time, straining toward the man and girl. "Last warning," the manager stated, firmly approaching their table. "We allow pets, but they must be well behaved." "I understand," Mason replied quickly, calculating his options. He couldn't risk being ejected from the restaurant, not when Shadow's behavior was so clearly indicating a potential threat. Across the room, the girl briefly looked up for the first time, her eyes meeting Mason's, with an expression that stopped his internal deliberation cold. In that fleeting moment before she quickly looked down again at a sharp word from the man, Mason glimpsed something that shifted his perspective entirely. Fear unmistakable and profound. But something else too. A desperate intelligence. A silent plea that cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a scream. The shift in Mason's mindset was immediate, from reluctant vacationer to police officer. Years of training and experience clicked into place, his senses sharpening as he scanned the scene with new eyes. "Okay," he whispered to Shadow, whose eyes remained fixed on the pair. "I hear you. Let's check this out professionally." "What can I do?" Adrian asked, her voice low but steady. Mason glanced at her, reassessing. There was no panic in her expression, just focused attention and a willingness to help. Her background in behavioral science could potentially be valuable in this situation. "I need to observe them without being obvious," he explained. "Shadow's alerting to something concerning about that pair, but I need more information before I can act." "The man's body language is controlling," Adrian observed discreetly. "Notice how he positions himself between the girl and the exit. That's a containment posture, not protective." Mason nodded, impressed by her insight. "You've got a good eye. Marine mammals use similar positioning when establishing dominance. Humans aren't as different as we like to think." They ordered dessert to justify staying longer, both maintaining casual conversation while carefully monitoring the interaction across the room. The man consistently positioned himself between the girl and the exit. When she needed to use the restroom, he walked her to the door and waited directly outside. Most concerning was their lack of natural interaction, no conversation, no shared smiles, none of the usual parent-child dynamic. The girl ate methodically, small bites taken with mechanical precision, rather than the usual enthusiastic or distracted eating patterns of children her age. Every few minutes, the man would lean forward, saying something too quiet for Mason to hear, causing the girl to nod without looking up. "If they're related, I'll eat my doctoral thesis," Adrian murmured. There's no familial comfort there. After finishing their meal, Mason decided on direct contact. Years of experience had taught him that sometimes the most effective investigative technique was also the simplest direct engagement under casual pretenses. "I'm going to approach them," he told Adrian. "Shadow's convinced something's wrong, and I trust his judgment. Can you stay here and be ready to contact local authorities if necessary?" "Of course," she replied without hesitation. "I'll keep my phone ready and watch for your signal." "Come on, Shadow," Mason said quietly. "Let's make some new friends." He approached their table with a practiced, easy smile. "Hey there. Sorry about my dog earlier. He gets excited sometimes. Mind if we join you for a minute? Just wanted to apologize properly." The man looked up, his expression guarded. "We're actually about to leave." "No rush," Mason replied, already pulling out a chair. "I'm Mason, by the way. Just in town for a couple weeks." "On, Daniel." The man replied reluctantly, his eyes darting to Shadow, who had positioned himself precisely between the girl and Daniel's chair. "And who's this young lady?" Mason asked, directing a friendly smile at the girl. Before she could respond, Daniel answered, "This is Emma, my niece." "Nice to meet you, Emma," Mason said directly to her. "How old are you?" The girl glanced quickly at Daniel before answering in a barely audible voice. 8. "Eight's a great age," Mason continued cheerfully. "My friend's daughter just turned 9. She loves the beach. Are you enjoying your vacation, Emma?" Again, Daniel intercepted. "She's tired. We've had a long day of activities." Mason noted Emma's unwillingness to look at either of them, her gaze fixed on the table. Her small hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. Up close, she appeared even thinner than he'd first noticed, her wrists fragile beneath the long sleeves of her shirt, despite the warm evening temperature. "Where are you folks visiting from?" Mason asked, maintaining his casual demeanor while cataloging every detail. "Westfield," Daniel answered after a slight hesitation. "Just here for a few days." "Westfield, I have colleagues there. Mason lied smoothly. Which part? North side. Daniel replied, his finger tapping rhythmically on the table. Look, we really should get going. Emma needs her sleep. Mason noticed Emma's small flinch when Daniel stood abruptly. It wasn't the startled response of a child surprised by sudden movement, but something else. A learned reaction, an anticipation of what might follow. No problem, just trying to be friendly. Mason remained seated, forcing Daniel to move around him. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Cute kid, Mason commented, slowly standing. She looks a little like you around the eyes, though the blonde hair must come from her mom's side. Her mother is my sister, Daniel replied, the details shifting. We should go. The inconsistency confirmed what Mason had suspected. First, Emma was his niece through unspecified relation. Then she was specifically his sister's daughter. A small discrepancy most wouldn't notice, but one that set alarm bells ringing for an experienced officer. Emma stood silently, her small hand automatically reaching up to be taken. The gesture struck Mason as rehearsed rather than natural, especially for an 8-year-old. As they moved away, Mason observed Emma's gait, the slightly reluctant steps, the unnatural stiffness in her shoulders, the way she maintained precise distance from Daniel, without the natural gravitational pull children typically have toward their caregivers. I hear you, buddy, Mason murmured to Shadow. Something's definitely not right. Mason returned to their table, where Adrian waited expectantly. What did you learn? She asked quietly. His story doesn't add up. First, the girl was his niece, then specifically his sister's daughter. He's controlling her movements and answering for her, and her body language is textbook fear response. What is she? No, Mom. What do? We notify local authorities and follow them discreetly, Mason replied, already reaching for his phone. I don't have jurisdiction here, but I can provide reasonable suspicion for Harbor Bay Police to investigate. Mason maintained a casual posture as Daniel and Emma moved toward the exit, but his mind was running through police protocols for suspected child endangerment. As he connected with the Harbor Bay Police Department, he watched Daniel guide Emma through the restaurant's patio area toward the boardwalk. This is Officer Mason Reed, Riverside County K-9 Unit, he explained to the dispatcher. I'm off duty in your jurisdiction at the Lighthouse Grill on Harbor Drive. I have reasonable suspicion of a child endangerment or possible abduction situation. He quickly relayed his observations and credentials, emphasizing the inconsistencies in Daniel's story and Emma's concerning behavior patterns. Units are responding. Estimated arrival 4 minutes, the dispatcher informed him. Please maintain observation without engagement unless the child appears in immediate danger. Understood, Mason confirmed. Adrian had already settled their bill during his call. What can I do? She asked as he ended the conversation with dispatch. Mason considered for a moment. Having backup would be valuable, but he was reluctant to involve a civilian in what could potentially become a dangerous situation. I need to follow them without being obvious, he explained. If you're comfortable with it, maybe walk on the opposite side of the boardwalk. 2 people with a dog might draw attention, but separate individuals are less conspicuous. I can do that, she agreed immediately. I'll stay within sight, but not obviously with you. Thank you, Mason replied, genuinely appreciative of her calm assistance. If anything seems to escalate before police arrive, move to safety immediately. Together, they left the restaurant, Mason allowing Shadow to lead, as they followed Daniel and Emma at a discreet distance. The boardwalk was crowded with evening tourists, providing good cover while making it challenging to maintain visual contact with their targets. Daniel moved with purpose, guiding Emma through the crowd with a tight grip on her shoulder. Through gaps in the pedestrian flow, Mason could see him leaning down to whisper something to Emma, her shoulders hunching further in response. The man's posture had changed, tension evident in every movement as he scanned the area with the wariness of someone who sensed danger. Mason spotted Adrian on the opposite side of the boardwalk, casually pretending to browse shop windows while keeping Daniel and Emma in her peripheral vision. She caught his eye briefly, tilting her head slightly to indicate they were turning off the main promenade. Shadow's pace quickened, his training kicking in as they pursued what his instincts had already identified as a threat. Mason shortened the leash, keeping his partner under control while allowing him to maintain the track. Daniel had reached the steps leading from the boardwalk to a less populated side street. The dimmer lighting would make it easier for him to disappear with Emma into the network of alleys beyond. Daniel. Mason called out, abandoning stealth as he recognized the danger of losing visual contact. "Excuse me, you dropped your wallet back at the restaurant." The manufactured excuse caused Daniel to hesitate momentarily, looking back with obvious suspicion. In that crucial pause, something extraordinary happened. Emma, seeing Shadow's attentive gaze fixed on her, suddenly made deliberate eye contact with the dog. With Daniel's attention momentarily diverted toward Mason, the little girl blinked 3 times in quick succession, an unmistakably intentional signal. Shadow's reaction was immediate. His ears pricked forward, his posture shifting subtly from alert to action-ready. The dog had recognized what Mason had missed, a distress signal deliberately directed at him. It wasn't unusual for Shadow to respond to human cues. That was part of his training. But this was different. The dog had recognized a specific pattern, a silent communication that transcended the usual handler commands. "I didn't drop anything." Daniel snapped his hand, tightening on Emma's shoulder. "Leave us alone." "Harbor Bay police are on their way," Mason stated firmly, closing the distance between them. "I think we should wait for them to sort this out." Daniel's expression contorted with panic and rage. "Stay back. She's my niece. This is none of your business." "Then you won't mind waiting for local police to confirm that?" Mason replied, maintaining a controlled approach. "Just let Emma step away while we sort this out." Daniel's hand moved toward his waistband, a movement that set off immediate alarm bells in Mason's mind. Whether he was armed or bluffing didn't matter. The gesture itself escalated the threat level significantly. "I'm not going back to prison." Daniel spat, his voice hardening. "Not for this. Not for her." As they turned to, Emma twisted just enough to make eye contact with Shadow, once more blinking that same deliberate pattern. 3 rapid blinks, a silent plea that transcended words. "Shadow, protect," Mason commanded, using their specialized command for situational intervention, rather than suspect apprehension. Shadow launched forward with controlled precision that belied his power. Years of specialized training had prepared him for exactly this scenario, neutralizing a threat without endangering a nearby vulnerable person. The Malinois moved with such speed that to onlookers he seemed little more than a tan and black blur. The technique was one they had practiced countless times in training, the barrier intervention designed specifically for situations involving a threat to a vulnerable individual. Instead of targeting Daniel directly with a bite, Shadow executed a perfect body check, angling himself between Daniel and Emma, while simultaneously using his shoulder and momentum to wedge them apart. The impact was calculated, perfectly enough force to break Daniel's grip on Emma's arm, but controlled enough to avoid knocking either of them down. Shadow's teeth remained sheathed, his specialized training allowing him to use his body as a tool rather than a weapon. In an instant, he had placed himself between predator and prey, a living barrier of muscle and determination. So what the... Daniel stumbled backward, momentarily shocked by the intervention. His hand reflexively moved toward his waistband before stopping, his eyes widening. As Shadow adjusted his stance, a low warning growl emanating from deep in his chest. "Don't move," Mason commanded, closing the distance with professional efficiency. "Emma, come here, honey." The girl didn't hesitate, scrambling behind Mason with a sob of relief, while Shadow maintained position, his attention fixed entirely on Daniel, who was now backed against the alley wall. "You can't do this!" Daniel shouted, his panic escalating as restaurant patrons began gathering at the commotion. "I'm her guardian. This is kidnapping." Mason displayed his badge, keeping his voice clear and authoritative. "I'm a police officer. Local authorities are en route. Please give us some space." The crowd backed away, many already recording the scene on their phones. Adrienne had appeared at the edge of the gathered onlookers, her expression concerned but composed as she positioned herself near Emma, providing an additional buffer between the child and her captor. "Emma, are you hurt?" Mason asked gently, keeping his primary attention on Daniel. No," she whispered, her small hands clutching the back of Mason's shirt. "Is your dog going to hurt him?" "No, honey. Shadow is just making sure he stays put until the police come," Mason assured her. 2 Harbor Bay police cruisers pulled up to the boardwalk, lights flashing. Officers emerged quickly, pushing through the gathered spectators toward the scene. "Officer Reed, Riverside County K-9 Unit." Mason identified himself immediately as they approached. Subject detained after attempting to flee with a distressed minor. Canine partner Shadow is maintaining containment only. The senior officer nodded acknowledgement. "We'll take it from here, officer," he stated, moving toward Daniel with handcuffs ready. "This is insane," Daniel protested. "I'm her uncle. This off-duty cop and his attack dog assaulted me for no reason." "Save it for the station," the sergeant replied, efficiently securing the handcuffs. A female officer approached Emma with practiced gentleness, kneeling to meet her at eye level. "Hi there, I'm Officer Ramirez. What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma," came the whispered reply, her small hand still maintaining contact with Mason for security. "Would you feel better if this officer and his dog came along?" Officer Ramirez asked, recognizing the child's attachment. Emma nodded immediately, her eyes finding Shadow with unmistakable trust. "He knew," she said, her voice slightly stronger. "I did the blinks like they taught us in school for when you're in danger, but can't say it out loud. I tried it before with other people, but nobody understood." Mason felt a surge of emotion at the revelation. The school's safety program teaching children distress signals had connected with Shadow's training in a way neither could have anticipated a silent communication that bridged the gap when words were too dangerous. "He's very smart," Mason confirmed, "and he wouldn't let anyone hurt you." As the officers led Daniel to the patrol car, Adrienne approached, her expression a mixture of concern and relief. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked quietly. "Physically, yes," Mason replied. "The rest will take time. Thank you for your help. Most people would have walked away. Most people haven't spent their careers studying communication across species boundaries." She replied with a small smile. "I knew your dog was trying to tell you something important. If you hadn't supported my suspicions, I might have second-guessed myself," Mason admitted. "Your observations were spot on." Officer Ramirez cleared her throat. "Detective Alvarez would like you both to come to the station to provide statements, and the little girl is asking for you and your dog." The Harbor Bay police station bustled with activity despite the late hour. Detective Alvarez, a seasoned investigator with salt and pepper hair and eyes that missed nothing, took Mason's statement with professional efficiency, paying particular attention to the signals that had alerted him to Emma's situation. "This 3-blink signal," Alvarez clarified. "It's being taught in schools now, or you won't." "Apparently," Mason confirmed. "It's part of newer safety programs teaching children how to signal for help non-verbally when they're in danger. And your dog recognized this as a distress signal?" Alvarez sounded skeptical. "Shadow is trained to detect subtle changes in human behavior," Mason explained. "He's specifically worked with victims of trauma and has been conditioned to respond to indicators of distress. The deliberate blinking pattern was unusual enough to trigger his alert response." "Impressive," Alvarez acknowledged. "Most people would have dismissed it as normal dog behavior." "Most people don't have partners like Shadow," Mason replied simply. Across the room, Adrienne was giving her own statement, her scientific background lending weight to her observations about Daniel's controlling behavior patterns. "Your friend's insights are remarkably perceptive," Alvarez noted. "Her analysis of predatory behavior patterns matches our trained profiler's assessments. She studies similar behaviors in marine mammals," Mason explained. "Apparently the patterns translate across species. Lucky coincidence that you were both there tonight." Mason thought about the captain's insistence on this vacation on the dinner meeting he'd reluctantly agreed to. "Maybe not entirely coincidence," he admitted. "Sometimes things align in ways we don't expect." After completing their statements, Mason and Adrienne were shown to a small conference room where Emma waited with a social worker. Shadow, who had been resting quietly at Mason's feet throughout the interview process, immediately perked up when Emma came into view. "You brought him!" Emma exclaimed, the first genuine animation Mason had seen from her. The transformation was remarkable, her face lighting up, her posture straightening as though a heavy weight had been temporarily lifted from her small shoulders. "He wanted to see you again," Mason replied, letting Shadow approach the girl at his own pace. Emma reached out tentatively, stroking Shadow's head with careful fingers. "Thank you for saving me," she told the dog solemnly. "I knew you were special when I saw you." The social worker, Ms. Chen, smiled at the interaction. Emma has been telling me how she learned the 3-blink signal at school last year. Her teacher showed the class a safety video about what to do if they were ever in danger. I tried it before. Emma said, her voice small but steadier now. At a gas station and at a doctor's office. Nobody noticed. Daniel said nobody would ever believe me, that they'd think I was making things up. Well, Shadow believed you right away, Mason assured her. That's what he's trained to do. Notice things other people miss. Emma nodded, her hand still resting on Shadow's head. Daniel isn't really my uncle, she confided. He took me from outside my school. He said my mom sold me to him and that I couldn't go home anymore. Mason exchanged a glance with Miss Chen, the implication setting off immediate alarm bells. The psychological manipulation was as cruel as it was effective, convincing a young child that she had been abandoned by the one person who should have protected her above all others. Detective Alvarez is working on finding your real family right now, Miss Chen assured Emma. We're going to make sure you get home safely. Can Shadow come visit me when I get home? Emma asked, looking between Mason and the social worker. I think that could be arranged, Mason replied, swallowing past the unexpected tightness in his throat. He'd like that. Detective Alvarez entered, his expression grim but satisfied. We've got a positive ID, he announced quietly to Mason and Miss Chen, keeping his voice low enough that Emma, now engaged in showing Shadow her drawings, couldn't hear. Emma Wilson reported missing from Westfield 11 months ago, abducted from outside her elementary school. Her mother has been searching for her ever since. And Daniel, Mason asked. Daniel Mercer. He's in the system. Prior conviction for child endangerment, suspected of involvement in a trafficking network we've been investigating for months. This could be the break we needed to unravel the entire operation. The significance wasn't lost on Mason. Emma's rescue might lead to the protection of countless other vulnerable children, all because Shadow had recognized a signal most humans would have missed entirely. We've contacted Emma's mother. Alvarez continued. She's driving down from Westfield tonight. Should be here by morning. In the meantime, Emma will stay in emergency protective custody with Ms. Chen. She seems to have bonded with your dog, Alvarez observed, watching as Emma continued to interact with Shadow the Malinois, showing uncharacteristic gentleness as he allowed her to guide his movements. It's not unusual in these cases. The first being to respond to their distress often becomes a temporary attachment figure. Shadow has always had a special way with victims, Mason acknowledged. Especially children. It's like he understands their vulnerability on a fundamental level. As the evening progressed, arrangements were made for Emma's temporary placement. When the time came for Mason and Shadow to leave, Emma's distress was visible. You'll come back tomorrow, she asked anxiously. Before I go home, we'll be here, Mason promised. Shadow wouldn't have it any other way. Outside the police station, Adrian waited, having completed her own statement. How is she doing? She asked as they walked toward the parking lot. Better than expected, given what she's been through, Mason replied. They've identified her and contacted her mother. Reunion should happen tomorrow. That's wonderful news, Adrian said, genuine relief in her voice. And all because your extraordinary dog recognized a signal that most humans would have missed entirely. They reached Mason's rental car, a momentary awkwardness descending as they realized their evening had taken a turn neither could have anticipated. I'm sorry our dinner was interrupted, Mason offered. Not exactly what you signed up for when you agreed to show a colleague's cousin around town. Adrian laughed softly. Are you kidding? I just participated in rescuing a kidnapped child. That beats small talk about Harbor Bay's tourist attractions any day. She hesitated, then added, though I wouldn't object to trying again tomorrow. Maybe lunch somewhere Shadow approves of. Mason found himself smiling. A genuine smile, not the professional mask he usually wore. I'd like that. As they exchanged numbers, Mason felt something shift within him. A subtle realignment, as though pieces long disarranged were beginning to find their proper places again. It wasn't just the satisfaction of a successful intervention or the professional pride in Shadow's performance. It was something more basic, more human, the simple recognition that connection, when offered, could be accepted without compromising the strength he had built around himself. Back at the hotel, Mason sat on the balcony watching the moonlight ripple across the dark water, While Shadow performed his nightly security check of their room, the events of the evening played through his mind, each moment analyzed with professional detachment, but also with something else. A growing awareness of how close they had come to missing Emma's silent plea for help. If Shadow hadn't been there, if he hadn't recognized the deliberate pattern in Emma's blinking, if Mason hadn't trusted his partner's instincts enough to investigate further, any break in that chain would have left the girl in Daniel's custody, her fate unthinkable. Shadow settled beside Mason's chair, his alert posture relaxed slightly in the security of their temporary home. Mason reached down, running his hand along the dog's sleek head in a rare gesture of affection. "You saw what I missed," he said quietly. "What everyone missed. How many times has she tried that signal, hoping someone would understand?" Shadow leaned slightly into Mason's touch, a small breach in his usual professional distance. In that moment of connection, Mason remembered why he had been drawn to K9 work in the first place, not just for the tactical advantages the dog provided, but for the purest form of partnership, one based on absolute trust and unspoken understanding. "Good job, partner," Mason whispered. "Really good job." The Harbor Bay Police Station was quieter the following morning when Mason and Shadow arrived. Detective Alvarez met them in the lobby, his expression somber but satisfied. "Mrs. Wilson arrived about an hour ago," he informed them. "The reunion with Emma is going well. Lots of tears, but the good kind. Our child psychologist is with them, now helping Emma process everything." "Any update on Mercer?" Mason asked. "Singing like a canary," Alvarez confirmed. "Turns out he's connected to a trafficking ring we've been trying to crack for nearly 2 years. His arrest could lead to dozens of rescues across 3 states. The enormity of what Shadow had initiated with his alert response was still sinking in. One dog recognizing one silent signal had potentially set in motion events that would save countless children from unimaginable horror. "Emma's been asking for you both," Alvarez continued. "When you're ready, I'll take you back." Mason followed Alvarez through the station to a specially designed family room, a space intentionally created to feel non-institutional, with comfortable furniture, warm colors, and gentle lighting. Emma sat beside a woman who was unmistakably her mother. The same delicate features, the same blonde hair, though the woman's face showed the ravages of 11 months of anguish and uncertainty. "Emma," Alvarez said gently, "Officer Reed and Shadow are here to see you." The girl looked up, her face transforming with joy as she spotted Shadow. "You came back!" she exclaimed, moving toward them with more animation than Mason had seen from her previously. Shadow, usually so reserved with strangers, stepped forward to meet her, his body language softening in a way Mason had rarely witnessed. There was something remarkable about watching his intensely focused partner voluntarily lower his guard for this child, a recognition of vulnerability that transcended training. "Mrs. Wilson," Mason said, extending his hand to Emma's mother. "I'm Officer Mason Reed. I'm very glad to see Emma back where she belongs." The woman grasped his hand with both of hers, tears filling her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "They told me what you and your dog did. I've spent 11 months imagining the worst, checking every lead, never giving up hope." "Emma did the hard part," Mason replied honestly. "She never stopped looking for a way to communicate even when all the odds were against her. She's extraordinarily brave." Mrs. Wilson nodded, watching as her daughter interacted with Shadow. "The detective told me about the signal she used, the 3 blinks. They showed it in a safety assembly at her school just a month before she was taken. I never imagined," her voice broke, "I never imagined it would be what brought her back to me." "Shadow recognized what humans missed," Mason explained. "He's trained to detect subtle communications, especially from people in distress." "I can never repay what you've done," Mrs. Wilson said. "But please know that you've given me back my entire world." Emma approached, her hand resting on Shadow's shoulder with easy familiarity. "Mom says we can get a dog when we go home," she informed Mason seriously. "Not a police dog, just a regular one. But I'm going to teach it to understand the signals too." "That's a great idea," Mason replied, kneeling to her level. "Dogs are very good at understanding what we need sometimes, even before we know ourselves." Emma nodded solemnly. "Shadow knew I needed help when nobody else did." She threw her arms around the dog's neck in a spontaneous hug that would have sent most working canines in a retreat. Shadow, however, remained perfectly still, allowing the contact with remarkable tolerance. "I made this for him," Emma said, handing Mason a carefully folded piece of paper. "It's a thank you card." Mason opened it to find a crayon drawing of Shadow recognizable by his distinctive ears, an alert posture, standing protectively beside a small blonde figure. Above them, in careful block letters, Emma had written, "Thank you for seeing me when nobody else did." "He'll keep it forever," Mason promised, the simple sincerity of the gift tightening his throat unexpectedly. As they prepared to leave, allowing the reunited family privacy to begin their healing journey, Emma approached Shadow one last time. "Goodbye, Shadow," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I'll never forget you." Shadow, in an unprecedented breach of his professional demeanor, gently touched his nose to Emma's cheek, a gesture so tender and deliberate that Mason could only stare in amazement. It was as though the dog understood exactly what this child needed in that moment, not just safety or protection, but acknowledgement of her courage and resilience. Outside in the hallway, Detective Alvarez shook his head in wonder. "I've worked with K9 units before, but I've never seen anything like what your dog did yesterday. That 3-blink recognition, it's extraordinary." "Shadow sees things most of us miss," Mason replied simply. "It's what makes him special." "Well, the department is formally recognizing both of you at a press conference this afternoon. The chief wants to highlight the importance of these safety programs in schools and the role of specialized K9 units in child protection." Mason's instinct was to decline. Publicity had never been his goal, but he recognized the value in raising awareness about the signals children like Emma might use when in danger. "We'll be there," he agreed, though Shadow gets all the credit on this one. As they left the station, Mason checked his phone to find a message from Adrian. "Still on for lunch, Emma's Cafe on the boardwalk at 101. They have outdoor seating that's dog-friendly." Looking down at Shadow, who patted beside him with his usual alert composure, Mason felt a smile for him. The second genuine one in less than 24 hours. "What do you think, partner? Up for lunch with a marine biologist before our press conference? Ishwi Kyo." Shadow's ears twitched forward, his stride lengthening slightly. As close to enthusiasm as the disciplined Malinois ever came. "I'll take that as a yes," Mason chuckled, typing a quick confirmation to Adrian. As they walked along the sunlit boardwalk toward the cafe, Mason reflected on the strange turns life could take. He had come to Harbor Bay reluctantly, seeing the forced vacation as an unwelcome interruption to his work. Instead, it had become the site of one of their most significant cases, a rescue that would potentially save dozens of other children through its ripple effects. More than that, it had shown him something about himself and his partner that years of successful operations hadn't fully revealed, that their connection transcended training and procedure, reaching into something more fundamental. The ability to recognize silent cries for help when others heard only silence. Emma's Cafe was busy with the lunch crowd when they arrived, but Adrian had secured a corner table on the patio with an excellent view of the harbor. She waved as she spotted them, her smile warming something in Mason that had been cold for longer than he cared to admit. "There they are," she called as they approached. "Harbor Bay's heroes of the hour?" "Pretty sure that title belongs exclusively to Shadow," Mason replied, taking the seat across from her. "I just followed his lead." "Don't sell yourself short," Adrian countered. "Most people wouldn't have trusted their dog's behavior enough to investigate further. Your partnership is what made the difference." The conversation flowed easily as they enjoyed their meal, discussing everything from Adrian's research to Mason's most memorable cases with Shadow. Throughout the lunch, Mason found himself sharing stories and perspectives he rarely revealed to anyone, drawn out by Adrian's genuine interest and insightful questions. "So what happens after your vacation?" she asked as they finished their coffee. "Back to regular duty in Riverside?" "Not exactly," Mason admitted. "Detective Alvarez mentioned that Harbor Bay is interested in consulting with us on developing a specialized K9 training program focused on recognizing child distress signals. After what happened with Emma, they see the potential for preventing similar cases." That sounds like important work, Adrian observed. Would you consider it a number one? Mason glanced at Shadow, who sat attentively at his side, ever vigilant, despite the relaxed setting. I think we would. There are more kids out there like Emma trying to signal for help in the only ways they can. If we can train more dogs to recognize those signals, then more children come home. Adriana finished softly. That's worth doing. As they prepared to leave for the press conference, Adrian hesitated, then asked, "How long are you staying in Harbor Bay?" "Originally 2 weeks," Mason replied. "But if this training program moves forward, it could be longer." "I'd like that," she said simply. "The extended stay, I mean. Harbor Bay has a lot to offer, especially with the right guide." The warmth in her smile stirred something in Mason that had been dormant for years. A recognition that perhaps the walls he had built around himself after his divorce, after the case that had nearly broken him, weren't the protection he had believed them to be, but a prison of his own making. "I'd like that too," he admitted, surprising himself with his candor. As they parted ways, Adrian knelt to Shadow's level. "Thank you for seeing what everyone else missed," she told the dog seriously. "Emma isn't the only one whose life you've changed." Shadow maintained his professional composure, but Mason noted the subtle shift in his partner's posture. A slight relaxation, a momentary lowering of the constant vigilance that defined him. It was as though Shadow, too, was beginning to recognize that their world could expand beyond the narrow focus of duty and procedure that had defined them both for so long. The Harbor Bay Police Department's press conference that afternoon drew more media attention than Mason had anticipated. The chief spoke eloquently about the importance of school safety programs, praising Emma's courage in remembering and using the distress signals she had been taught. When it was Mason's turn to speak, he kept his remarks brief and focused on Shadow's training and abilities, emphasizing the dog's extraordinary capacity to recognize subtle human communications. "What happened yesterday wasn't just good fortune," he concluded. "It was the result of specialized training combined with a child's remarkable presence of mind. Every child should know these signals, and every adult should be watching for them." The questions from reporters centered primarily on the 3-blink distress signal and how other adults might recognize it. Mason found himself unexpectedly passionate as he explained the importance of adults paying attention to children's nonverbal communications, especially when they seemed out of the ordinary or deliberate. "Children in dangerous situations often can't speak freely," he explained. "They rely on adults to recognize their signals for help." Emma tried multiple times before Shadow understood what she was trying to communicate. "We need to do better as a society at seeing these silent pleas." After the press conference, Chief Rodriguez approached with an official letter of commendation for both Mason and Shadow. "We'd like to discuss the possibility of you consulting on our new K9 program," he said, shaking Mason's hand. "Your experience and Shadow's demonstrated abilities would be invaluable in training our officers to recognize the signs that most of us miss." "I'd be honored to help," Mason replied sincerely. "Shadow and I both would." As they left the police department, Mason's phone rang with a call from Captain Donovan back in Riverside. "Heard you've been busy," the captain said without preamble. "Can't even take a vacation without finding trouble." "It found us, actually," Mason replied, watching Shadow patrol the perimeter of the parking lot with his usual thoroughness. "We were just in the right place at the right time." "That's not how Detective Alvarez tells it. Says your dog recognized a distress signal that trained officers missed. Something about blinking. Shadow caught it," Mason confirmed. 3 blinks a safety signal they teach kids now. "I never would have noticed it, but Shadow picked up on it immediately." The line was silent for a moment before Donovan continued. "The department's been approached about expanding our K9 program to include training specifically for recognizing child distress signals. Seems your vacation adventure has sparked some interest." "That's unexpected," Mason replied. "The Riverside Journal is running a piece on it tomorrow. Silent Signals, How a Police Dog Rescued a Missing Child. They want to interview you both when you get back." "Both of us?" Mason laughed. "Shadow's not much for interviews." "Maybe not," Donovan acknowledged, "but he's apparently pretty good at hearing what needs to be heard." The captain's tone softened slightly. "I want you to take the full 2 weeks, Reed. You've earned it." But when you get back, we've got work to do. There are more kids out there who need what you two can do." As he ended the call, Mason gazed out at the harbor, the late afternoon sun gilding the water with gold and amber light. Shadow sat beside him, a silent presence, radiating the strength and focus that had made him such an extraordinary partner. Together they stood man and dog, united by a shared purpose that transcended species: to protect, to serve, to listen for the silent signals when no one else could hear them. 3 weeks later, after returning to Riverside County, Mason received a package forwarded from the Harbor Bay Police Department. Inside was a carefully framed crayon drawing showing a blonde girl standing beside a tan and black dog with unusually alert ears. The note, written in the painstaking handwriting of a child, read, "Dear Officer Mason and Shadow, I got my dog. Her name is Hope, and I am teaching her special signals. Mom says we can visit you someday. Thank you for hearing me when nobody else did. Love, Emma." Beneath the signature was a small paw print in blue ink, Hope's contribution to the correspondence. Mason pinned the drawing to the bulletin board in the K-9 unit's training room, right next to the departmental commendation they'd received for the case. It served as a daily reminder to all the handlers and their partners of the profound difference they could make in a world where sometimes the most important messages were spoken without words. And in the quiet moments between calls during training sessions, when Shadow demonstrated for new recruits how to recognize the subtle signals that might indicate a child in distress, Mason would sometimes think of Emma and her deliberate 3 blinks, a silent cry for help that only Shadow had understood. The specialized training program they developed over the following months expanded to K-9 units across the state, incorporating recognition of nonverbal distress signals into standard training protocols. Other handlers sometimes questioned the necessity of such specific training until Mason showed them the video footage from Harbor Bay's boardwalk cameras, capturing the moment when Emma had signaled to Shadow 3 deliberate blinks that had changed the course of numerous lives. As for Shadow, his already impressive reputation had taken on an almost mythical quality within law enforcement circles. The dog who could read human signals with uncanny precision, who had recognized a plea for help that trained officers had missed entirely. Requests for demonstrations and training consultations came from departments across the country, all eager to develop K-9 units with similar capabilities. Through it all, Mason maintained regular contact with Adrian, their professional collaboration on the training program gradually evolving into something more personal. Her insights into animal communication patterns proved invaluable in refining the training protocols, while her presence in Mason's life slowly helped him rebuild the connections to others that he had allowed to atrophy over years of solitary focus on his work. And on quiet evenings when cases were closed and reports filed, Mason would sometimes find Shadow sitting at attention by the front window, his gaze fixed on the world beyond, with the same unwavering vigilance that had saved Emma Wilson's life. In those moments, Mason understood that their work was far from finished, that for every child who found a voice through 3 desperate blinks or a quiet signal, there were others still waiting to be heard. But thanks to one extraordinary dog who refused to ignore what humans had missed, more eyes were watching now, more ears were listening, more hearts were open to the silent cries of those who needed them most. And that, Mason reflected, as Shadow turned to meet his gaze with those intelligent amber eyes, made all the difference in the world.